Games are almost always separated into two different parts: the story and mechanics. These two parts of the game are often found to be in conflict with each other, resulting in games either having strong story and no gameplay, or a lot of gameplay and no story. Separating a game into these two parts doesn't give a full picture. Games are a lot more complicated than that, and it's worth looking into defining games in a different way. In the growth of indie development, there have been a few new game design terms that have cropped up. I think that some of these terms are important enough to be included on the list, such as atmosphere, world building, and game feel. Terms like these have been pioneered by popular indie titles such as Limbo, Firewatch, Super Meat Boy, and Hotline Miami. These should be considered as just as important as mechanics and story, because adding these different parts to the list of fundamental game design categories would allow for a different perspective on game design. Story is one of the hardest things to get right in a game, which is why it's important to break it down into its different parts, the story itself and how it's implemented. The story itself is a part of game development that is often overlooked when first creating a game. The variety of game types and lengths make it difficult to understand how to go about creating a story in a video game. A good starting point is the basics. All stories have a beginning, middle, and end. But often a game can have multiple stories within a single game. This is the difference between linear and non-linear games. A linear game has a single overarching story, while a non-linear game has multiple stories within the game. The next step to take is to pick out what story structure to work from. There are many different story structures, like the 5 plot points, the hero's journey, or a TV show structure. This is all up to you and what type of story you want to tell. A shorter game might best fit the 5 plot points, but a fantasy game might work best with the hero's journey. The most important part is to have a clear introduction, middle, and conclusion. Another important aspect to good storytelling is to have well-established characters that grow over time as the story progresses. The lack of character development in a story often leaves the player feeling like the story was a waste of time. This is often the result of a character not learning anything or having a change of heart. If you have a look at the movie industry, almost all of the highly praised movies have a character that undergoes a personal change. Another important aspect to good storytelling is to think about how to implement the story. There are many different mechanics that have been created to help aid storytelling in an interactive medium. These are cutscenes, quick time events, conversational systems, narration, environmental storytelling, and custom mechanics. Environmental storytelling uses level design with text and objects to tell a story. Custom mechanics uses objects or talents that the player uses to experience the story. It's best to use the mechanics that best suit the story you are trying to tell, and always find the best way to include interactivity. Games like Firewatch and Bioshock are great examples of successful implementation of these story mechanics. The atmosphere of a game uses art and level design to create a single look and feel to a game. Game titles like Limbo, Journey, Abzu, and Bioshock Infinite are all games that are praised for their atmosphere and environment. Limbo uses dark colours and silhouettes to give an atmosphere that's disturbing and eerie, while Bioshock Infinite uses old Americana, steampunk, and heaven imagery to establish a utopian feel. Beginning your game with a clearly defined atmosphere allows it to have a single personality and helps the game to have a more coherent and holistic vision. It's also important to have the atmosphere match the story of the game. The atmosphere of the story should be connected and benefit one another. World building is the act of creating a believable world. It is essential for the player to be able to get lost in the world and story. It allows the player to connect with the game and increases their engagement. To build a believable world, everything within the game needs to be justified and have a purpose. It's something that games struggle with constantly. An example of this would be a person standing on a corner for no reason, waiting for a stranger to interact with them. The best games ever made still have a problem with inexplicable game elements that are never justified within the context of the world. Make sure you always question why something is placed a specific way, or why a character is doing something. Everyone and everything should have a clear reason for being somewhere. A believable world does wonders for story engagement. Players show massive amounts of appreciation for dedication to world building. It's something that should be in the back of your mind in every element of the game. Game feel is the feeling of a game's controls. It's the satisfaction of movement within a game. Game feel is mostly associated with games like Super Meat Boy and Hotline Miami. But how do you improve it? I've found that game feel can be greatly improved by putting an emphasis on implementing the 12 principles of animation. These are the fundamentals of animation and are a great resource if you want to improve your game feel. Now, these shouldn't be directly implemented, but translated with an emphasis on feedback and control. The 12 principles of animation are squash and stretch, anticipation, staging, straight ahead and pose to pose, follow through and overlap, slow in and slow out, arcs, secondary action, timing, exaggeration, solid drawing, and appeal. I'll be going over a few of these and describing how they should be implemented in a game. Slow in and slow out is an aspect that's very different in games. It's essential to realism, but in video games this can sometimes be in direct conflict with the responsiveness of controls. It's a fine balance between quick feedback and realistic animation, and this balance changes depending on what type of game you're creating or even what type of animation you're making. For action animations, quick feedback is essential, but for slower animations, it's best to aim for more realism, especially when you're focusing on story and world building. This also changes for what type of action. A dagger in your action game might need to be fast, but a large sword should have a slow in to highlight the weight of the weapon. Game feel also requires satisfying controls. In principles of animation, this can be achieved by focusing on squash and stretch, anticipation, follow through and overlap, secondary action, and exaggeration. In games, the anticipation of an action can sometimes be controlled by the player. In Angry Birds, this is the action of pulling back on a slingshot before it releases a bird. This can also be achieved by having anticipation be controlled by the down press of a button or the pull of a trigger, and have the action played on the release of the button. Secondary action is also different in games, because the primary action is controlled by the player. Adding secondary action in video games allows you to give the primary action meaning. These secondary actions can also be separately animated so they can be added to multiple different primary actions. To get a more in-depth explanation of these principles, check out Alan Baker's Tutorials YouTube series. The mechanics of a video game can be described by the amount of complexity, which measures the level of complexity of a video game's mechanics and can be separated into two different types: mechanical depth and breadth. Breadth is the amount of different mechanics in a video game, and depth is the connection between those mechanics. In Minecraft, a way to increase breadth is to add new objects to the game, and depth is increased by adding different crafting options to these same objects. Another important aspect of mechanics is balance. This is the act of equaling out the different types of mechanics. This is required when different choices of mechanics are given and are able to interact. Balance is evening out the fairness of the game to equal out the advantages and disadvantages of different types of mechanical choices. When developing a game, it is often difficult to see what aspect of your game needs improving. This way of categorization allows you to look at your game at a new perspective, and look for new improvements from areas that are often hard to grasp. A game shouldn't try to focus on all of these categories at once. They aren't laws. But I think they could be used to understand where a game excels with a deeper understanding than just story and mechanics.